Welcome to episode number 78, Signs of 12, Part 2, The Convergence, where spiritual and temporal, past, present, and future combine. My name is Adam, and while I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, these opinions and ideas are my own. I encourage you to seek study by learning, seek truth by study, and also by learning and by faith. So today we're going to continue on part 2 of the video on Signs of 12. And this is relating to President Nelson's passing and the Quorum of the 12, leading the church after his passing, and the calling and sustaining of a new president of the church, a new prophet, seer, and revelator, President Dallin H. Oaks. And I would say new, meaning new president, but not new as in prophet, seer, and revelator. He's been doing that since 1984 when he was called. All right, so continuing on, here is a table again, kind of recapping some of the things that have happened. And this kind of is connected with the feasts, the Feast of Trumpet, Day of Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles. So Feast of Trumpets is Rosh Hashanah, September 22nd, September 24th. People involved, Israel, Jewish nation, people all over the world. You have a Feast of Trumpets where Trump actually had a feast with the royal king and queen of England in Windsor Palace. I think it was the 17th of September. Then you have Trump addressing the United Nations where he sort of rebukes all the countries in the world. September 23rd, 2025 on the actual Rosh Hashanah date. Rosh Hashanah begins at sunset, and he was speaking at 6:36 p.m. Israeli time, which is 11:36 Eastern Daylight Time. If this video that I'm referring to, or I got this, is correct, and I haven't validated, but I'm going to assume it's about the time that he spoke. So he's rebuking all the countries. He talked for about an hour. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but that's kind of the gist of all I want to mention. I also looked at September 23rd, 2025, and what was significant in world history. I don't know if this means anything, but it is the 75th anniversary of landings at Incheon, a Korean War event. We have some conflict a little bit with Korea now in the U.S. There was a sign of this earlier when the Trump administration went into an area that was making batteries for a Korean company and arrested a bunch of people who he said were working illegally. Without going too much into the politics of that, you can see the tension with Korea that this was creating. Okay, then continuing on. September 23rd, 1995 to September 23rd, 2025 is a 30-year anniversary of The Family, A Proclamation to the World by President Gordon B. Hinckley. And in 1995, in September 23rd, it was 3 days before Rosh Hashanah, kind of like a 3-day warning or like a sign of 3. And President Hinckley gave that. And I believe he released it to the Relief Society session of General Conference. So he's talking to the women, but he's also addressing it to the world. And it's interesting because 30 years later, 9/23 would fall on Rosh Hashanah, and then Trump would be addressing the world. So it's like a trumpet to the world. And the Family Proclamation says at the end, we warn that nations, the calamities that will come upon nations and people that disregard the principles taught in the Proclamation on the Family. And that's kind of summarizing and paraphrasing what it says. But so the location, the world, Rosh Hashanah, 1995, September 25th, 1995. And then you have later 30 years, 9/23, 2025 is 30th anniversary, and on Rosh Hashanah. Now, 3 days after that, let's see, 4, 3, yeah, so, 4 days after Rosh Hashanah, that's right. Okay, so President Nelson dies Saturday, September 27th, 2025, at 101 years old and 18 days. And he dies at a little after 10 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So it's after midnight when you look at it from the perspective of New York. He's no longer the 11th hour. It's time. It's 12. And this is a sign of judgment. It's after 12. And now the Quorum of the 12 start to lead shortly after midnight New York time on September 27th, 4 days after Rosh Hashanah, 4 days after the New Year. And there's more to it, but I'm going to stop there in this particular slide. Now, President, I think it was President Eyring who first said this. He said thus began an apostolic interregnum. And he said that in, I believe, General Conference, the first session or something, where he said, as soon as the apostles are leading the church, that is known as apostolic interregnum, which is the apostles, sign of 12, leading the church. And this would last for 18 days. Notice President Nelson lived 101 years old and 18 days. 18 days later, on, October 14th, President Oaks would be sustained and set apart as the next prophet, and the church would announce that, and the first presidency held their first press conference. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, so another thing that happens right after the prophet dies, so the prophet died, that's interesting. The prophet died at a little after 10 p.m., so basically 12 hours later, a sign of 12. Wow, I learned something new. A sign of 12. Saturday. Well, wait, it says Saturday. It's Sunday. Sunday is the next day. Sunday, 9:28. Shortly, it says at 10:25 Eastern Daylight Time. Grand Blanc, Michigan, attack on the church. Attack on the church in Grand Blanc, Michigan. And so there were 4 killed, 8 injured, 12 total, plus many others, I'm assuming. So 8 plus 4, that's 12. That's a sign of 12. 4 killed, 8 injured. Now 4 can be a sign of the world. North, south, east, west, the total dominance of the king, the 4 quarters of the earth, the king of heaven and earth. There are signs of 4, signs of 8, signs of 12. And you see here, it's 9:28. All right. Memorial service held for President Nelson, October 1st, for the world, in Salt Lake and online. So now you have like this beginning, October 1st, beginning of the new month. It's day 1, and you have this memorial service, and we remember him. 7 days later, October 7th, you would have his funeral, and then 7 days after that, you would have October 14th, you would have President Oaks being announced as prophet. Now, October 4th, again, another sign of 4, October 4th, General Conference, Saturday session, I think it is. Yeah. President Eyring announces the Quorum of the 12, which consists of 14 apostles leading the church at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, which would be 12 p.m. Eastern Time. This is the Saturday AM session, another sign of 12. It's 12 New York time. The 12 are leading the church, presiding over the church. Now, the Quorum of the 12, we often think it means 12, but it actually is like an office, like apostle. Because here you have 14 members of the, quote, Quorum of the 12. Because as soon as the prophet died, there was 15 apostles. Now there's 14 because one died. So the 2 counselors then go back into the Quorum of the 12 according to the order of seniority in which they were called. So the senior member is then President Oaks, and the acting president, President Holland, then becomes not acting anymore because President Oaks is acting as the president because now he's the senior member of the Quorum of the 12. So if you realize that sometimes these quorums and priesthoods are not exclusively and only to represent numbers, you can see some of the greater signs. For example, 70, Quorum of the 70 isn't necessarily 70 members all the time. Likewise, the 144,000 that are mentioned in Revelations in D&C 77, I don't believe it's constrained to 144,000. I think it's a symbolic number that is representative of their office. That's a topic for another day. But so continuing on in the calendar, October 6th, 2025, 9 a.m. to 11 p.m., which is 11 hours duration, in Salt Lake City, you have President Nelson's viewing. People involved, the world, and people in Salt Lake City or whoever can come there. So here you see a sign of 11 hours duration. You see 6, like half of 12, 10-6. And then you have his funeral on the 7th day at 12 p.m. 12 p.m. noon, Mountain Daylight Time, in Salt Lake City. and broadcast to the world. And it's also the day of the 2-year anniversary of the attack of Hamas upon Jerusalem on 10/7/2023. So this is where I say the prophet's birth, life, and death are assigned in Israel and for ancient Israel and for modern day Israel, meaning the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who believe that President Nelson is a prophet, was a prophet, seer, and revelator, and led the church and the Lord's true church. So you can see how there's this 2-year anniversary of the attack of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem on October 7th, 2023 was mourning because they just got attacked. And then 2 years later, they are rejoicing because they're hearing that their hostages are going to go free soon. War and peace is supposed to be reached, but with Hamas. And then in modern day Israel or Salt Lake City, you have people mourning. So first Israel mourned, then they rejoiced. Israel was at peace and rejoicing in 2023, and now they're mourning in 2025. So I compare this to the events in October in Matthew chapter 16, verse 19 and 17, 1-3, where Jesus promises the keys of the kingdom and the sealing power to Peter. And he says, whatsoever thou bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I will give you the keys, and upon this rock will I build. And if you look in the Bible dictionary, and I've covered this in prior videos, under Transfiguration Mount of, it says it occurred in October, about a week before the Mount of Transfiguration. So if you say about a week, because it says 6 days, after 6 days, so if you count 6th or the 7th day, depending on how you count it, it was about a week. Who was involved? Jesus, Peter, James, and John. Now if you add Moses and Elias, parentheses Elijah, then you have the Mount of Transfiguration, you have the sealing power, Elijah, you have Moses, the gathering power. And what did President Nelson do during the time he was prophet? He was talking about the gathering of Israel. He was extending the blessings of the sealing power through temples, through the 200 temples that he announced during his time. And then 7 days later, October 7th, 2025, 7 days later, October 14th, you have the announcement of President Oaks becoming a prophet and the first presidency reorganization, with President Eyring being the first counselor and President Christopherson being the second counselor. And the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, I believe it is President Jeffrey R. Holland, who is still the senior member. So he is the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which now those 12 are 11 at the moment, because there are only 11. They haven't yet filled the vacancy. So again, Quorum of the 12 Apostles, there's only 11 now. Before there was 14, now there's 11 in that quorum, in one way of looking at it, you know. So depends on your perspective, really. But this is interesting because October 14th, 2025, this is a 2-year anniversary of the 90% eclipse that crossed Utah, October 14th, 2023. So you have another 2-year anniversary, first in Israel and again in Utah. It was over the western parts of the U.S., but it did cross over Utah. And I said at the time that I believe this was a sign of the Mount of Transfiguration, because it happened in October. 6 months later, you had a 4/8/2024, April 8th, 2024, 100% solar eclipse that completed the chiasmus, or the X sign, from the two eclipses 2017 to 2024. And those were 6 years, 6 months, and six weeks apart. And there is a 777 sign I'm going to get to later in the life of President Nelson. But anyway, 6 can represent a half an hour, half of 12. It can represent a half an hour of silence, some other things like that. So anyway, back to the eclipse. It's a 2-year anniversary of the eclipse over Utah. And I said it represented a Mount of Transfiguration. Well, now you have 2 years later, the world and the church are being transfigured from President Nelson to President Oaks. First, we had a heart surgeon, a physician during the worst pandemic. Now we have a judge during a time of judicial unrest and questions about law and constitution. So this forebodes, what's the word? It's foreboding. It's an ominous sign of continued judicial conflict that we've had since the beginning of this year, since January 2025, when President Trump came in. Likewise, 7 years earlier, exactly, well, almost exactly. President Nelson was sustained as a prophet in 2018. In January, you go 7 years later, President Trump coming in January 2025. So you have the 7-year pattern happening. Now, if you look on the Gazetteer in the Bible dictionary, one belief is that Mount of Transfiguration was Mount Tabor in Israel. Happened during the last October of Jesus' life. 6 months later, March, April, Passover time, Christ would do the atonement. And so that is another sign. So here we have, again, D&C 101. We were studying D&C 101 when the prophet turned 101. And here's another interesting thing. He was 101 years and 18 days old when he died. Now, if you look at D&C 101, 18:19, verse 18 and 19, it says, "They that remain and are pure in heart shall return and come to their inheritances, and all these things that the prophets might be fulfilled." So if you look at the prophets year and month and correspond it to a section and verse of the Doctrine and Covenants, 101:18, 101 years old, 18 days, and compare that to President Nelson, he's pure in heart, he's returned and come home, he's died. And this is so that the prophecies and the prophets might be fulfilled. His mission is now fulfilled and it's over with. Now, this is another interesting one that I saw, Daniel 9:27. The prophet died September 27th, 9th month, 27th day. Daniel 9:27, "He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week," 7 days. He was senior apostle for 7 years, 7 months, 7 weeks, and 7 days. That's 7, 7, 7, 7, 4 sevens in a row. Now, the way you count this is you go January 2nd, 2018, when President Thomas S. Monson died, President Nelson became the senior apostle at that time. So from the time he became the senior apostle, January 2nd, 2018, until 27th of September, 2025, he lived 7 years, 7 months, 7 weeks, and 7 days exactly. And if that isn't a sign and a wonder from heaven, I don't know what is, because you can't make this stuff up. Only God can do these things. In fact, when President Nelson was called as prophet, he mentioned his life, and he said, "My life has been spared many times." He's talked about several of those in conference. One of them was he was in an airplane, it was diving, the engine went out, the pilot did his emergency heroic maneuver, dove down, put out the fire with the air, and then restarted the engine, and he lived. That was one example. And he also, I think it was his very last conference talk, he mentioned, "A man once held a gun to my head, pulled the trigger, and the gun did not go off." And so he didn't even say that till I think it was one of his last conference talks, or the one before that. And he says when he was first called, "The Lord is in charge of life and death. He can take us at any moment. My life has been preserved." For what? For a sign and a wonder in heaven, and for his mission that he was going to do. His wife and others have said President Nelson was called and foreordained before the foundation of the earth to be a prophet in these latter days at this specific time. And this is one way you can see it. So in the week of September 22nd through September 28th, 2025, we were studying Come Follow Me, D&C 106, 107, 108. 107, the order of the Son of God, verse 22 through 27. Oh, there's again 27. He died on September 27th, Daniel 9:27. We were studying the quorum of the 12, and we were studying the 3 presidents in verse 24, meaning the first presidency. Unanimous consent of the quorum of the 12 in verse 27. And then 9:27, that's when they had this unanimous consent of who's leading the church, which is the prophet, President Dallin H. Oaks. So then you go forward 7 days after the funeral of President Nelson, October 14th, the apostolic interregnum ends, lasting 18 days. President Nelson lived 101 years, 18 days. Then 18 days later, the first presidency is reorganized, and President Oaks is sustained as the 18th president of the church by the Quorum of the 12. And the first presidency is sustained by all the members of the Quorum of the 12 also. Okay, then what happens, again, recapping, we have this violent attacks in Michigan, in Grand Blanc, Michigan, killed 4, injured 8. That's 12 people affected, less than 12 hours later. So a sign of 12 again. Temporal and spiritual are happening, you can see, between President Nelson's death spiritually and temporally, this attack. I shouldn't say all eyes, but many eyes in the world are then focused on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Again, first with President Nelson's piece in Time magazine article, then second with Charlie Kirk shooting in Utah, third with the death of the prophet, and then you have these attacks again in September. I guess that's 4 times if you count it that way, in Grand Blanc, Michigan. Then you have a beginning memorial service October 1st for President Nelson, and October 4th, President Eyring announces the Quorum of the 12 leading the church in the General Conference session. This was another interesting insight I noticed when I reviewed his last talk. I just went to the General Conference webpage and I looked at the length of the video, and guess what? It is 11 minutes and 59 seconds long. Imagine that. It's like 1 minute to midnight on the clock. If you compare that to midnight, it's like he's giving his 11th hour, his last minute address. And he, in April of 2024, he announced 15 temples, bringing the total number to 200 temples, and announcing this at 3:45 p.m. Mountain Time, which is 5:45 Eastern Time. So it's almost 6 p.m. Eastern Time, which is halfway between 6 and midnight for New York City. Now, again, this would be 6 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 6 hours before midnight, 6 months later from April into September. Let's see, April, May, June, July, August, September, 5 months. So 5, almost 6 months. He would die. So this is kind of like a half an hour of silence. He is no longer addressing the world between, well, he's probably giving talks and addresses, but he's not addressing General Conference again after this April conference. So it's like his silence. He wouldn't address General Conference again in his lifetime, and he would die nearly about halfway through the 12-month cycle, or 6 months before the 12-month yearly cycle. So another way to look at this, there was I haven't confirmed it, but I've read a news article that said this, that the prophet, President Nelson, I don't think it was 1, 2, 3 days before he died, it was released at that time. He may have happened earlier, but he was reported that he started to lose his eyesight and became dark, and he said, "I can't see." So this is, again, like a half an hour of silence. This is like going before the darkness and contemplating the darkness right before creation and let there be light. And you can read about that in the Book of Melchizedek, in the apocryphal book called the Book of Melchizedek. Jehovah or Yahweh or God goes before the darkness, says, "Let there be light," and the earth is revealed after it was created. And so this is a pattern for dividing, separating, and creating new things. So there's darkness before light. Again, this was his last conference address. Here's a little snippet from him waving to people after it's over, or maybe it's before, but on April 6, 2025. Also 15 new temples. 15, First Presidency, Quorum of the 12, is 15 apostles. And it represented 52% of the church's 382 total temples. So this is a sign, again, a sign of 200. It's a Feast of Tabernacles, a Feast of Temples. We've had 200 temples in a little over 7 years that have been announced. So here is the last one I'm going to leave you with, which is the sign of 4 sevens. So if you're wondering how you calculate this, here is how I calculated it. So in the Western world, in the Gregorian calendar, it's named after Pope Gregory, the one we use today. We have months like January through July, August, September, October, November, December, and so on. And we're used to counting more than 4 or 5 weeks as another month, and we add a month. But the Lord deals in years, months, weeks, and days. And he wants to give signs for each of those periods of time. And it is, you can read this in the Bible dictionary about the feasts and the times, but it was known that a period of 7 anything represented completeness and holiness. 7 24-hour periods, 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark taken together, is a 24-hour period. That is a day, one complete cycle of day and light, dark and light. That day, grouped in 7, the 7th is holy. That is the Sabbath. 7 days are holy, and that completes 1 week. 7 weeks were holy, and the 50th, 7 sevens, 7 weeks, 7 days, 50 days, was the day of Pentecost, which was also holy. 50th, 50th day, 50th year, Jubilee year in the Old Testament. Then you have 7 months, also considered holy, and then 7 years. 7 months. So the 7th month is kind of like the Feast of the Passover that's holy. We have this Feast of the Passover, Feast of Weeks. You have the Sabbath, like the Last Supper, Passover feast. And then you have 7 years, which is also holy. The prophet lived over 7 years. And the 7th year is known as a sabbatical year, a year of rest in the Old Testament. The people of Israel were instructed to let their fields lay fallow or not farm them, and let the earth rest for a Sabbath year. And so the 7th year was holy. That's why we have statute of limitations, 7 years. That's why we have 7 years of negative credit report history maximum, and up to 10 years of good things, kind of like a sign of the 10 Commandments. So now if you look at this again, 2nd of January 2018 is when President Thomas S. Monson died. Upon the death of President Monson, President Russell M. Nelson became the senior member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles because he was called the earliest. And until then, until he died on September 27th, 2025, there was 7 years, 7 months, 7 weeks, and 7 days. So you add 7 years to January 2nd, 2018, you get January 2nd, 2025, which is on a Thursday. You add 7 more months to that. January plus 7 months is August 2nd, 2025 on a Saturday. You add 7 weeks to that. August 2nd, 2025, adding 7 weeks. September 20th, 2025, also on a Saturday. And then you add 7 days from the 20th of September, you get 27th of September, 2025, also on the Saturday, which is the exact day that President Nelson died. Shortly after 10 p.m. Mountain, 12 a.m. midnight, New York time. So again, this is representing 7 periods of sanctification, holiness, completeness, perfectness, a Sabbath, and then 4 can represent the world or the complete sovereignty of the King of heaven and earth, as in 4 quarters of the earth, 4 directions of the kingdom, north, south, east, and west. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and how you can see the temporal and the spiritual combine, how the Lord is showing wonders and miracles in our prophets, in our times, in our seasons, our days, months, weeks, and years. I know that President Russell M. Nelson was a prophet of God during the time he presided, and I also know that President Dallin H. Oaks is now the prophet. He leads and guides this church, and he leads and guides the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is the Lord's church. It is not led by a man. He is his instrument, but the Lord Jesus Christ leads his church. I know that this is the restored Church of Jesus Christ. This is the latter days, and we are trying to become saints, and hence the name of the church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I share that with you in the name of Jesus Christ.